I think the video title is pretty self-explanatory. This video is just going to be me grading every major trade of the deadline, little things like, I don't know, Marquise Chris of the Spurs, I'm not really going to look into, but every trade that is noteworthy, I'm going to be grading for both sides of the deal. All I will say for this intro is that if you're not already, go subscribe to my second channel where you can get some of my reactions to the trades that happened initially, most notably Nikola Vucevic to the Bulls, because as a Bulls fan, you can imagine I was pretty excited. So that channel is going to be linked in the description as it always is. But with that, let's just roll the intro. Before I continue on with this video, about half of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed, so if you fall into that 50%, then subscribe. Also drop a like on this video, it only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. Also real quick, I should mention that if you haven't already, the final episode of my Sixers My NBA that was delayed for about 5 weeks is finally out. So if you've been watching that series and you did not know already, the final episode is out, so go watch it. Let me start with the first major move, which was Nikola Vucevic going to the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls received Nikola Vucevic and Al-Farouq Aminu for Otto Porter, Wendell Carter Jr., and 2 first-round picks. Those picks are 2021 and 2023 from the Bulls, and they are both top 4 protected. So this deal, the Bulls get back an all-star center, and the Magic get back a young prospect in Wendell, an expiring contract in Otto, and 2 first-round picks. And for me, I think this is a very even trade. For the Bulls side of things, the only reason why I wouldn't give this an A+ and actually lean towards an A- is that those first round picks, if the Bulls don't figure it out in this year's playoffs or in this year's standings and they don't make the playoffs, then you just gave up a lottery pick for a 30-year-old center, even if he is a very good one. But I'm not too concerned about that. I think at the very least the Bulls will get in the playoff tournament or the play-in tournament with this move, and they should win it. So I'm not too concerned about that. And it's also a good push to get Zach LaVine to stay with the team, because he's talked about forever how he wants to play with a really good big man. They just got him a really good big man, and now they can give him a max extension that he will probably be more inclined to take now that he has actual help on his team. For the Magic side of things, Wendell Carter Jr. still has incredible potential. He was having a horrible season this year to the point where I finally kind of gave up on him, but really that's just my impatience because I'm one of the most impatient people in the world. But Wendell can still be a very good defensive center with offensive upside, and I think that's a not bad player to get back when you're replacing Nikola Vucevic, as well as 2 first-round picks that this year will probably be in the middle of the draft, and maybe even next year will be. It depends what improvements the Bulls make in the offseason. So I would say for both sides, I'd give this trade about an A-. So yeah, very even. The Boston Celtics receive Evan Fournier, and the Orlando Magic receive 2 second-round picks. Of course, Boston used their trade exception in this deal, so that's why there's no player coming back for them. The reason that I don't love this trade as much as many other Celtics fans might, as good as value of 2 second-round picks for Evan Fournier is that I feel like you could have done more with a $27 million trade exception. That's the thing, is like also Evan Fournier is on a 1-year contract, so like I would have rather secured someone who I know can be here for a while and maybe given up bigger draft assets. For example, Nikola Vucevic, apparently there's a rumor that the Celtics had an offer for him with that trade exception along with a couple of first-round picks. I would have personally gone all in and just said, fuck it, here's 3 first-round picks from the Celtics and the trade exception, and yeah, you would have given up more draft capital, but you would have got a way better player who is on the team for 2 years rather than 1. But regardless, Evan Fournier is a good pickup and pretty much exactly what the Celtics need in terms of guard depth, so I think that's fine, and they only gave up 2 second-round picks, but I feel like you didn't really maximize the potential of that trade exception, so I think I'm going to give Boston a B- on this deal. And then for the Magic side of things, 2 second-round picks, dude, for Evan Fournier. I know he's on a 1-year contract, and he's not that young, but you just traded an 18-point scorer who does it efficiently for 2 second-round picks, I feel like you could have got a first-round pick out of him. And even if you couldn't this year, you could have traded him way earlier when you should have and got really good value out of him. So if anything, the L here is waiting too long. So I'm going to give them a D+. The Denver Nuggets receive Aaron Gordon, and the Orlando Magic receive Gary Harris, RJ Hampton, and a 2025 first-round pick. So, this deal I find interesting on the Magic end of things. We're starting with 3 Magic trades back-to-back as they were clearly the biggest sellers of the deadline. So, from Magic side of things, RJ Hampton, it's like, yeah, that's a good young player to get, but at the same time, you already have Cole Anthony and Markelle Fultz on the team, so I'm curious how that's really going to work. Luckily, because both of those guys are out with injury, you are going to have plenty of opportunity to see what RJ can do in a bigger role. He'll probably get around 25 minutes a game for the remainder of the season, but if you figure out all 3 of them are good, you're going to have to ship off one of them, and I guess it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely interesting that they went for a guard here. And then outside of that, I mean, Gary Harris, his contract expires in 2 years, I believe. That's fine. He could even be a buyout guy, maybe. That's probably pushing it. And then you get a first-round pick, although the impatient part of me goes 2025. We have to wait 4 years for this first-round pick to convey, but, you know, it's still fine. And then on the Nuggets side of things, I mean, Aaron Gordon is a fantastic defensive forward who could fit well into their offensive scheme. The only concern for them is the three-point shooting, but other than that, he fits perfectly, and he can really fill the role that Jeremy Grant left behind, where he can be that big defensive-minded forward who can do a little bit offensively, but primarily is just like a guy who you can throw at a LeBron James and be like, hey, this is not the worst matchup in the world. By no means am I saying Aaron Gordon is going to shut down LeBron, because no one can do that pretty much, but he can definitely not be a terrible matchup when the Nuggets previously had pretty much nothing but terrible matchups. The Sacramento Kings send Nemanja Bjelica to the Miami Heat in exchange for Mo Harkless and Chris Silva. This move for the Heat side of things, they're getting a stretch 4, which interestingly really plays into a move that they do later on where they moved Kelly Olynyk, and they are also sending a young player in Chris Silva, who I don't know much about, but the Sacramento Kings should hopefully get some use out of. Nemanja is pretty damn old, but he is a good three-point shooter, not this season, but in general, so he can be a stretch big who can probably play like 18 minutes a game for the Heat. Toronto trades Norman Powell to the Portland Trail Blazers for Gary Trent and Rodney Hood. Now on the Raptor side of things, you really had to trade Norman Powell as he was about to be an unrestricted free agent at about 28 years old, so moving on from him was what this franchise needed. And doing so, they get back a fantastic replacement, because Gary Trent Jr. I think is going to be as good as Norman Powell is now by next season, and he is going to be 23 by then. So you're getting younger, a player who is going to be as good, who is on a rookie contract that you have restricted free agency to extend, and you get back Rodney Hood as well, who can hopefully turn his career around, as this year he has been really bad coming off of his Achilles injury, but regardless, that's something. And then for the Portland Trailblazer side of things, I feel like I'm the only one that's really low on this move for them, because while Norman Powell is better than Gary Trent right now, as I said earlier, I think the difference is going to be very negligible very soon. But then on top of that, you have to go with an older player that you do not have restricted free agency rights to, so if they want to leave, they can just leave. So that's a problem, and I would just rather have had Gary Trent, who is cheaper, is younger, and I know that I can stay on the team with restricted free agency if I have to. And to trade away that guarantee of Gary for a little bit better of a player in Norman Powell, I think is a mistake. Yeah, you got the best player in this deal, but I would rather have the security of Gary Trent as well as the youth of Gary Trent over Norman Powell. So I'd give this trade like a C- for the Blazers, and I'd give it an A+ for the Raptors, because Gary Trent, like that's more than I thought you could get out of Norman Powell. So fantastic move on their part. The Hawks trade Rajon Rondo to the Clippers for Lou Williams. So this move, I think, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? Because I don't think it's really going to do that much. So for the Hawks side of things, I don't really see what difference it makes to have Lou Williams versus Rondo. I guess just more of a scoring presence over a playmaking one, and Rondo has not been good this year, so Lou Williams has also not been good this year, so but for the Clippers side of things, you hope that playoff Rondo can be a thing. Of course, playmaking is an issue with the Clippers, so I do think they get like a B+ out of this trade. For the Hawks side of things, I don't see really the point. So I guess I give this like a C. It's neutral. I don't really care one way or the other. I don't think it makes that much sense for the Hawks to make this trade, really. I feel like you maybe could have got a second-round pick or something out of Rondo, and that would have been better than this, but it is what it is. And then finally, for one more move, the Chicago Bulls received Troy Brown Jr. as well as Daniel Tice. The Boston Celtics receive Mo Wagner, and the Washington Wizards receive Daniel Gafford and Chandler Hutchinson. At least that's how I'm summarizing the move in my head. So for the Bulls side of things, Troy Brown Jr. is a player that definitely has offensive upside. If you looked at his bubble stats, though it was on very poor efficiency, he did average 15, 7, and 5 when the Wizards no longer had Bradley Beal and he had to step up. He is a defensive-minded forward who is also a good rebounder, who has shown a lot of playmaking chops. Now, his three-point shooting is a level of concern, but he can definitely be a valuable forward, and he is young, so that's nice to have. Then also Daniel Tice is better than Daniel Gafford. Two Daniels being traded for each other. He is more of a does the little things type of player, and a guy who you're not really going to notice being all that impactful unless you're really looking for the tiny details. Daniel Tice is a fine backup 5, and he is a backup to Vucevic now, so it's not great to have him as a starting center, but to have him as a backup who gets like 18 to 20 minutes a game, perfectly fine. And then for the Wizards side of things, both players they got back in this I think are worse than the players that they traded. Mo Wagner is probably a little bit better than Daniel Gafford, at least offensively, and Chandler Hutchinson is not as good as Troy Brown Jr. as much as I love Chandler Hutchinson. So it's two younger prospecty players who can be more defensive-minded, which I suppose makes some sense for the Wizards side of things, but I don't know that they really got the better players out of the deal. And for the Boston Celtics side of things, Mo Wagner has like potential to be a pretty good scoring presence off of the bench, so I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but I think I would have just rather kept Daniel Tice. But it also possibly frees up more minutes for Robert Williams, who has been awesome this year for the Celtics, so I think it's fine. So for the Celtics, I'd probably give this a B. For the Wizards, probably give this a C+. And for the Bulls, I'd probably give this a B+ to an A-, because you got two players out of this deal that are better than the two players you traded. So that's a W. The New Orleans Pelicans send JJ Redick and Nico Melli to the Dallas Mavericks in exchange for James Johnson, Wes Iwundu, and a second-round pick. For the Mavericks side of things, Nico Melli sucks, so he's not important, but JJ Redick is a very good three-point shooter who can come off of the bench or even start at times, and that is more spacing and kind of fills the Seth Curry role for that team. All you're sacrificing is Iwundu, who is a young player who has some potential and a second-round pick. I don't think it's the end of the world in that regard, so I think it's pretty good trade for them. And then for the Pelican side of things, it's a whatever return. Both sides, I don't really think it matters too much, although JJ Redick is going to be a role player that actually can play in Dallas, whereas the players they traded really were not playing that. So that's a good return, or that's a good trade for Dallas. I'd give them like a B+, and for the Pelicans, well, C+, I guess. And then last but not least, the Houston Rockets trade Victor Oladipo to the Miami Heat for Avery Bradley, Kelly Olynyk, and a draft swap. I'm thinking the Rockets traded Oladipo for two role players on, I think, expiring contracts in exchange for a first-round pick swap with a team that's going to be better than them, so it's probably not going to amount to anything. This was not a good trade at all. And really, it's worse in the context of, like, this is the only player you got back in the James Harden trade. Now, I am seeing a lot of people way over-exaggerate that this trade just makes the Harden trade look horrible. Like, Victor Oladipo was only a small part of the Harden trade. It was much more about the first-round picks that they got, which even if a lot of them are going to be late first-round picks, you can't say, like, 8 first-round picks is not a lot, because it is. But yeah, the fact that you're not the only players you get back in a James Harden trade is Avery Bradley and Kelly Olynyk, that's pretty fucking pathetic, regardless of all those first-round picks. So with the context of this being the player you got back in the James Harden deal, that's bad. That's really bad. So I'm going to give the Rockets an F on this trade. That's the only F that I'm giving. And on the Heat side of things, I'm not as in love with this move as a lot of people are, just because I'm a little bit concerned about the fit on that team. Of course, I think, you know, Oladipo has said he wants to be there, and I think it's a good cultural situation for him. I'm just curious in terms of the X's and O's stuff, how he's going to fit being more of a shooter and doing ball handling stuff that might interfere with Jimmy Butler and all that stuff, what minutes he's going to get in and how that might be a sacrifice of some of the spacing without Tyler Hero or Duncan Robinson out in favor of him. Defensively, of course, he fits in perfectly fine, and he can bring in some playmaking, but I'm just not sure because Oladipo is not the most sure thing in the world. But I definitely don't think the Heat gave up anything noteworthy in this deal, so I'd still give them a B plus or something, somewhere in that ballpark, somewhere in a B. So yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. I'm just not as like, oh yeah, this is an amazing move for the Heat, because I think there's ways that this could not work. But other than that, the only things to talk about really are players that were not traded or teams that did not make a trade, which is another element to winners and losers and stuff like that. So for the Lakers side of things, not trading Talen Horton-Tucker for Kyle Lowry, I think was a mistake. Now, what a lot of Lakers fans said was, really, you want us to trade Schroeder, KCP, and Horton-Tucker for just Kyle Lowry? Now, first of all, yes, I do think that would have been a good trade. But regardless, if you want to make the argument 3 players over 1, which is fair enough, I suppose, the thing is that Horton-Tucker is the reason the deal didn't happen. Like, if you want to argue, hey, we'd rather just have KCP as a 3-and-D role player, we're kind of short on those. We would rather have Schroeder, who's not, you know, miles worse than Kyle Lowry. He's like probably 70% as good, and then Horton-Tucker on top of it might be pushing it, but like, the potential of Horton-Tucker when you are trying to compete with the Brooklyn Nets right now, when you just declined to trade for a star player, I think that's a very different circumstance. Like, it's not necessarily that the trade itself would have been good, but that Horton-Tucker and his potential is what prevented you from doing it. If you want to just say, hey, we don't want to trade those 3 players, and that's fine, that just can't be the reason, in my opinion. I think a lot of Lakers fans have this tendency to pick a young player that you just fall in love with and massively overrate, and then it ends up being the bane of your existence eventually. Looking at you, Kyle Kuzma. But other than that, the Pelicans did not trade Lonzo Ball. That is a massive W. Now, I wanted them to trade Lonzo Ball. I very, very badly wanted them to trade Lonzo Ball to the Bulls, but it was smart from their franchise's perspective not to trade Lonzo. I thought it was stupid that he was in rumors to begin with, so it was very smart that they did not end up moving them. But I can't think of any other major trade that didn't happen or should have happened and didn't, that like was an L. Like I said, the Celtics not getting Vucevic, that's an L, so that's a thing. But other than that, I think for the most part, this was not a huge deadline, other than the Bulls getting Vucevic. There was no star player moved in this deadline, so unless you want to say Victor Oladipo is, but he's a question mark star at the very least. But yeah, not a crazy deadline, but some decent moves, and I don't think there was any major loser outside of the Houston Rockets. Everyone else, all the trades were either neutral or good. So yeah, that's how I view this. But yeah, that's it. Shout out to Rudy for editing this video. That is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and cue the outro music.